In the years-long tabletop role-playing game campaign that I led, the entirety of the story culminated on the top of a high castle tower. All around the tower, a war raged on with the party's allies fighting the army of the campaign's big bad, named King Ghidorah. Steel rang, the sound of various spells boomed, magically empowered vehicles resounded with massive blasts, airships and fantasy starfighters whizzed past, and even a gigantic gold dragon roared with fury. However, on top of that tower the party gathered to thwart the plans of Ghidorah himself, a powerful fighter and wizard. Various devices and runes glowed about the villain. This wasn't going to be an easy fight. The players faced a battle that also had an element of a puzzle. To reduce the power level of the king, they had to disable some of the surrounding devices. It took time and a lot of resources, but finally, the foe fell. But anyone who's played a fantasy RPG knows that the final boss never has only one form. There's gotta be a second phase to the fight. And Ghidorah did not disappoint in that expectation. The party barely had a second to rest before some glyphs around the tower lit up, and flashing into existence, a huge metallic dragon construct appeared. The big bad had bagged a new bod. Ghidorah's essence filled the robotic dragon, and the fight was on again. Not quite as difficult as the first phase because of the lack of a puzzle, but the second phase continued to dwindle resources. Eventually, the metal dragon also fell from the sky. With the party celebrating the victory and looking out to the surrounding battle of armies, the party member with the highest perception noticed that Ghidorah's sword disappeared from existence. And just then, an ally of the party sent a mental message and image to the heroes. A room on the lower level of the castle with vats full of Ghidorah clones, each of which could easily house the essence of the wizard king after his death. Likely one had already fulfilled its purpose when the dragon fell. Leaping off the height of the tower with the various means of flight, teleportation, and mystical ability, the party landed on the ground quickly, and ran to the clone room. Along with several of their allies, the party began destroying tank after tank of complete and not yet fully formed clones. But a noise alerted them of where Ghidorah's essence had fled. Naked human flesh, along with the hint of a steel blade, flashed out of the room. The party gave chase and followed out of the castle, only to discover a freshly embodied clone of the villain. The third phase of the final battle had begun. But this one only lasted a couple of rounds, because most of their foe's tricks had been disabled, and much of his power came from the gear that had been lost in the previous fights. The big bad had become a pale reflection of the mighty foe he'd been to start with, merely an echo of an echo of an echo. And thus, with the third phase complete and every known clone body destroyed, the party rejoiced in victory as life could again return to normal for the country. Life feels like that sometimes, doesn't it? More than sometimes, far too often. The problems of this life batter us around, we fight and struggle and endure. And just when we think that we can take a breath, another phase to the fight begins. That breath is taken, our resources deplete. It seems that we're about to fall over, until finally relief appears on the horizon. But then, another hint of a problem rears its ugly head. Over and over again, the problems of this life refuse to die. Endless phases of perpetual problematic clones. When it comes to we who follow Jesus, our good King who brings restoration to his humble people, the moment will come when those problems are nothing more than a raging little man uselessly swinging a sword our way. The battle that Jesus fights for us, the one for which victory has already been guaranteed, will be done in a flash, hardly even a sweat broken. Restoration will succeed in the end. But it is difficult for us in the present where the repetitions of the problems of this life persist. We trust in our God that he will bring about victory and restoration, but we must continue to press forward in the midst of repeated troubles, evils, and rebellions. How can we stand when another hit strikes us before we've even recovered from the previous one? Relying on God, resting in the knowledge of his victory is easier to say than to do, but it is the way. And perhaps, as we look to this passage for this sermon from our series of the book of Samuel, the series that we're calling A Song of Failures and Hope, we can see how David rests in the hope of God's restoration, even while an echo of rebellion sounds across the land. Throughout several previous sermons, we've seen the rebellion led by Absalom, the son of David. And regardless of David's desire to keep the boy alive, Joab killed the usurping prince. David didn't take that well, but for the sake of his people he continued to lead through his tears. In the last sermon, we saw a host of people come to return their king to his capital. All humbled themselves before the king, but some began to fight over who was the most humble in front of David, and the tribe of Judah became pitted against the rest of the tribes, rebellion seeming to still echo in their minds. The inevitable second phase of this battle brewed. And this is where we begin 2 Samuel chapter 20. Before David had even gotten close to the completion of his return to Jerusalem, echoes of discord spread. 2 Samuel chapter 20, verses 1 to 2. Now there happened to be there a worthless man, whose name was Sheba the son of Bichri, a Benjamite. And he blew the trumpet and said, We have no portion in David, and we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. So all the men of Israel withdrew from David, and followed Sheba the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah followed their king steadfastly from the Jordan to Jerusalem. The author of the passage gives us clear insight into how he feels about this rebellion, right at the beginning of his description. He calls this Sheba a worthless man. We might not think of this phrase as that condemnatory, but the Hebrew is quite explicit. Literally translated, it would be a man of Belial, wicked, worthless, utterly vile. Think of the most terrible, horrible, and disgusting type of person that you can. And the author would say that Sheba was worse. A person who rebels against God's chosen king will not be looked upon well. Sheba was a Benjamite, someone from the same tribe that Saul had been. So he too might have been a pro-Saul individual who despised David's reign. But regardless, he felt that David held no regard for anyone other than those in Judah. In Sheba's mind, it was as if the rest of the country had no claim in their king, no hope in finding the restoration of God that comes through his chosen king. And notice near the end of verse 1 where Sheba calls David son of Jesse. It's been a long time since we've seen David called that. It had been Saul's favorite derision against David. A nobody from a line of nobodies. That's who you are, David. When Sheba used the phrase, I'm sure he was giving it the same spin that Saul had held with it. The worthless, evil, vile man Sheba succumbed to name-calling against God's chosen king. Derision along with his rebellion. Not much has changed in the 1,000 years since, huh? And many followed in the rebellion of Sheba. They'd thought that God's chosen king was there to fulfill their wants and desires, that he was supposed to perform as they saw fit, instead of following their king into the ways of God. And so, a second phase of rebellion struck the land. Only the tribe of Judah remained to bring David back to his capital. And even though there was a second phase of rebellion brewing, David still had some last few ramifications from Absalom's rebellion to take care of. 2 Samuel chapter 20, verses 3 to 7. And David came to his house at Jerusalem, and the king took the 10 concubines whom he had left to care for the house, and put them in a house under guard and provided for them, but did not go into them. So they were shut up until the day of their death, living as if in widowhood. Then the king said to Amasa, Call the men of Judah together to me within 3 days, and be here yourself. So Amasa went to summon Judah, but he delayed beyond the set time that had been appointed him. And David said to Abishai, Now Sheba the son of Bichri will do us more harm than Absalom. Take your lord's servants and pursue him, lest he get himself fortified cities and escape from us. And there went out after him Joab's men and the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and all the mighty men. They went out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba the son of Bichri. There was still some fallout that David had to deal with in Jerusalem. Remember that a few chapters ago, Absalom had attempted to assert his dominance as king by taking the previous king's harem as his own. Partially because that's what kings in the surrounding nations were supposed to do, and partially as a ramification of David's sin with Bathsheba. Thus Absalom raped the 10 concubines in a tent on the roof of his palace. Well, now that David had returned home to the throne, something needed to be done with those 10 concubines. The most likely outcome in the situation, if it were to be done in the ways of the kings of the surrounding nations, is that the women would be put to death, any remnants of rebellion stomped out, even though the women had been innocent. However, as we saw with David's actions in the previous chapter, he wasn't going to be responsible for any deaths with regard to this rebellion. So he left the women alive, but he also refused to lay with them. They were functional widows. This action not only allowed David to follow a more godly pursuit of life and purity, 2 things he'd taken to heart because of his sin of sleeping with Bathsheba and killing her husband Uriah, but this action also allowed him to showcase wisdom. Those concubines were likely a part of political alliances. To put the women to death would be to end the treaties they represented. Thus, by keeping them alive, David kept the treaties in place. There would be no relational bridge burning because of the rebellion. It was only after David had completed the deal with the aftermath of Absalom's rebellion that he began to focus on the second phase. This is something we can learn when it comes to dealing with the repetitions of this life's problems. See the ramifications of the previous problems to the end before moving on to the next. Leftover loose ends must be handled with wisdom and godliness, and to full completion, lest they return to being problems later on. But David also realized that failing to quickly deal with the second phase of rebellion would be a problem. So he sent his new general Amasa, who'd replaced the rebellious Joab as leader of the army, to gather the fighting men of Judah in order to put an end to Sheba's rebellion. The king gave his general 3 days, but Amasa had failed to show up in time. Because of previous failures, David had learned not to let years pass before dealing with a problem. That's what had allowed Absalom's rebellion to happen to begin with. So David needs to move, even if it's just with his special forces units and some mercenaries. But he was not going to let Joab lead. No, he turned to Abishai, Joab's brother, to lead the soldiers. Although do notice how verse 7 still calls them Joab's men. Many among them were still loyal to the previous general, probably deferring to him as often as they could. And while David wished to handle the rebellion quickly and properly, another decided to live up to the rebellious echo of his own. 2 Samuel chapter 20, verses 8 to 13. When they were at the great stone that is in Gideon, Amasa came to meet them. Now Joab was wearing a soldier's garment, and over it was a belt with a sword in its sheath fastened on his thigh. And as he went forward, it fell out. And Joab said to Amasa, "Is it well with you, my brother?" And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. But Amasa did not observe the sword that was in Joab's hand. So Joab struck him with it in the stomach and spilled his entrails to the ground without striking a second blow, and he died. Then Joab and Abishai his brother pursued Sheba the son of Bichri. And one of Joab's young men took his stand by Amasa and said, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab." And Amasa lay wallowing in his blood in the highway, and anyone who came by seeing him stopped. And when the man saw that all the people stopped, he carried Amasa out of the highway into the field and threw a garment over him. When he was taken out of the highway, all the people went on after Joab to pursue Sheba the son of Bichri. While there are many things that we can learn about dealing with the repetitious problems of this life, repeatedly being a problem is not one of them, no matter what Joab seems to think. He just can't stand anyone other than himself being in charge of the army, and he becomes an echo of his own rebellious self. We might even have felt a little bit of deja vu, if not for the fact that we're on an open road here instead of in a dark back alley, for all that Joab seems to love assassinating other generals. The absent General Amasa had not abandoned the fight. He'd just taken a little longer than David gave him to gather the fighting men of Judah. And so the army he led met the special forces unit and mercenaries that Abishai, led. So as the two sets of armed forces met to become a single unit, the leaders came together as well. And notice, it is Joab who takes the leadership role instead of his brother Abishai. Joab was in full battle regalia when his cousin Amasa drew near. Just then, the deposed general had an idea, a way to regain his role. He pretended to trip while his sword accidentally fell out of its sheath. And in one swift motion, Joab picked up his sword with his offhand, and then continued to his supposed greeting. Of course, there hadn't been time to put the sword away, but why should Amasa be worried? The pair of cousins embraced in a familial manner, which gave Joab the moment he needed to repeat his assassination protocols. One single strike that opened his cousin's gut. I guess it gets easier the more often someone does something like that. The body hadn't even yet kicked up dust before Joab and his brother Abishai continued on their march toward Sheba's rebellion. And one of Joab's closest sycophants started shouting out that anyone who's on David's side should fall in line behind Joab. He just continued shouting that, while the fallen ex-general gurgled his last breaths. But the rest of the army saw the violence for the disturbing truth that it was. They paused by the body, possibly with respect for the dead, and possibly because they just followed that guy to this location, with wonder of what they'd gotten themselves into. If this is what happened to their general, what was going to happen to the rest of the nation that followed Sheba's rebellion? But doubts and questions have no place in the iron-handed dictatorship that is Joab's army. So the sycophant dragged Amasa's body off the road and covered it. The less questions that the warriors had, the better. At least that's the way Joab would have seen it. However, now Joab had a direct mission ahead of him. He had to stop Sheba's rebellion, no matter the cost. Because even complete victory against this rebellion might not stay David's hand. Not against him, not against a repeated murderer and assassin, and certainly anything less than complete victory would not stay that hand. There had been enough echoes of rebellion for David, and Joab just kept adding up more. And so, after seeing this side story of rebellion, we get back to dealing with the main story of Sheba's rebellion. But it is nothing in comparison to the one that Absalom had led. Absalom's rebellion had taken chapter after chapter. We read minute details and tactics and battle arrangements, but Sheba's rebellion here is over almost as quickly as the Gedare clone fight. With that said, let's look at the passage. 2 Samuel chapter 20, verses 14 to 22. And Sheba passed through all the tribes of Israel to Abel of Beth-Maacah, and all the Bichrites assembled and followed him in. And all the men who were with him came and besieged him in Abel of Beth-Maacah. They cast up the mound against the city, and it stood against the rampart, and they were battering the wall to throw it down. Then a wise woman called from the city, Listen, listen, tell Joab, come here that I may speak to you. And he came near her, and the woman said, Are you Joab? He answered, I am. Then she said to him, Listen to the words of your servant. And he answered, I am listening. Then she said, They used to say in former times, Let them but ask counsel in Abel, and so they settled the matter. I am one of those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. You seek to destroy a city that is a mother in Israel. Why would you swallow up the heritage of the Lord? Joab answered, Far be it from me, far be it, that I should swallow up or destroy. That is not true. But a man of the hill country of Ephraim called Sheba the son of Bichri has lifted up his hand against King David. Give him up alone, and I will withdraw from the city. And the woman said to Joab, Behold, his head shall be thrown to you over the wall. Then the woman went to all the people in her wisdom, and they cut off the head of Sheba the son of Bichri and threw it out to Joab. So he blew the trumpet, and they dispersed from the city, every man to his home. And Joab returned to Jerusalem to the king. Sheba had been riling up the entirety of the nation, and had led his Bichrites all the way to Abel of Beth-Maacah. We're talking far north in the country, about as far away from David's capital as someone could be while still being in Israel. And the members of Sheba's rebellion gathered in the city. But Joab's army was right behind, all the way to the city walls. Because the gates had been closed, the Judean army besieged the city. This needed to be done quickly, so battering the walls down would be better than cutting off supply lines and waiting for the rebellion to starve. But as they were building ramps so that the less structurally sound parts of the wall would be hit by their battering rams, a wise woman calls out for Joab. Another echo. Joab and a wise woman. Back in chapter 14, Joab had used a wise woman to convince David to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem. But now a wise woman comes to convince Joab. I find the interaction kind of funny. Joab draws near the wall, probably with his helmet squarely secured so that no stray projectile hits him. He had learned from history, after all. And he calls out, Someone over there looking for the general of the army. The woman peeks over. Yeah, you him? Are you Joab? And he replies, That's me. And then she continues with the back and forth, saying, Well, then you gotta listen. Joab, probably wondering if this was gonna lead anywhere, sighs and then says, I'm listening. Go ahead. The whole thing is kind of humorous to me because of how long it takes to get to the point. It just keeps repeating, echoing, almost. An unnecessary call and response between the pair. But finally, the woman gets to her point. She says that the city used to be a place where people came together to settle disputes. But now Joab had come to tear it all down, overthrow peace and covenant faithfulness, swallow up a precious heritage of the nation. If the wall were to be torn down on this border town of Israel, then other enemies would certainly take whatever had not been destroyed by the Judean army. But Joab denies the claim. Far be it from me that I should swallow up and destroy. Sure, Joab, far be it from you. There's a corpse on the side of the road that would like to disagree with that. And another one buried under some rocks in a forest. Oh, and there's one more buried in Jerusalem along with the head of one of Saul's sons. Amasa, Absalom, Abner. Does your brother Abishai have to worry about how many people with A names you've killed? We all know that Joab is truly a man of blood, a bloodthirsty assassin who cuts down anyone who gets in his way. But Joab continues his denial anyway. In verse 21, Joab gets to his reason for this assault against the city. It houses a rebel named Sheba. If the people of the city were to hand him over, then they'd have nothing to worry about. Wait, is this Joab using his head for something other than to plan a murder? Is he trying to keep casualties to a minimum? He really must be trying to get on David's good side, so that the death of Amasa doesn't cause Joab's own demise. Regardless, the plan works. The wise woman gathers the city's denizens and calls them to shut down this rebellion. There really couldn't have been that many Bicrites if a bunch of townsfolk could take them down and cut off the head of their leader. Although, in truth, the feeling of rebellion against the house of David still pervades the nation for generations to come. With Sheba's head in hand, Joab calls off the army, and they head back to Jerusalem. And David has to deal with Joab taking the role of general without permission once again. But we don't get to see that in the text. The rest of the chapter might seem like a tagged-on little bit of information, but the truth is that its inclusion shows a sense of return to normalcy for the nation, a setting of law amidst the rebellion. So we'll read it, make a couple of comments, and then move on to our conclusion. 2 Samuel chapter 20, verses 23 to 26. Now Joab was in command of all the army of Israel, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada was in command of the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and Adoram was in charge of the forced labor, and Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud was the recorder, and Sheva was secretary, and Zadok and Abiathar were priests, and Ira the Jairite was also David's priest. Yeah, I know, I want to shake my head at how Joab got back in charge of the army once again. A terrible person who is too good at his job. Other than that, we can see that David faced the repetitious problems of this life and faced them head on. He didn't let the repeated rebellions keep him from performing the job God had for him. The nation needed stability after 2 back-to-back rebellions, and David tried his best to provide for those under his leadership. He worked with God to bring as much restoration as he could while still in this life. That's the thing. Repetition of the problems of this life will happen, but restoration will succeed in the end. We can't control the events that lead to problems, troubles, depressions, anxieties, and all of that type of stuff. We don't have the power to change it. And to even think of trying would be forcing others beyond their free will, which would be its own type of evil. But what we can control is our reaction to the problem. Do we continue on with the work God has for us? Or do we echo the rebellion against God's chosen king and bring destruction to others? The first helps us in bringing about restoration that God wants to bring to his humble people, while the second tears down peace and covenant faithfulness, no matter how much we deny it. If we truly desire peace and covenant faithfulness, then we will work with our King to bring about restoration. And we might as well do that, since Jesus will bring us the ultimate restoration one day, the day that the echo of rebellion finally dies, with the faintest whimper.